Okay, floor is open for questions on any of the pieces of the presentations that were made. Floor is open. Brooks? We've got a roving mic, I think. Also a stand-up mic in the back. Please identify yourself and fire away.
Mic in the front, too.
A standing mic right here.
I'm Brooks Colburn. I'd like to hear from any of you. What do you think about the probability of any nation actually defaulting on its sovereign debt?
Well, of course, we've seen sovereign defaults before. They have not been that infrequent, and I'm sure that we'll see them again. Now, one needs to be careful about what the definition of a default is. Technically, Paul Volcker and Jacques de la Rosière assure me that in the debt crisis of the 1980s, no Latin American country, in fact, defaulted. And that's literally true. There was not a legal default. But I think we had much the same result. There was effectively a restructuring of the debt. I think in Europe that's the most likely course by far. There's going to be a backdoor restructuring of the Greek debt. The amount of official financing will expand. Banks will be persuaded to roll over the debt. The European Central Bank will support this operation. Legally, a sovereign default is an extraordinarily messy business, and I think that there will be a great incentive to avoid that degree of clarity. Or as I commented in my paper, muddling through is a particular European accomplishment, and I expect they're going to continue to muddle. We muddle a lot here, too. It's the way business is done. When you get a default explicit, I mean, you have a collapse of the entire regime, and that's not what we're seeing in these countries. So Sudan did indeed default, but it ceased to exist as a country, and there are a number of others in that category.
Okay, next question.
David Wessel from the Wall Street Journal. Nick Lardy, what are the risks that something could go wrong in China? What things worry you the most?
Well, implicitly, I think I already answered that. Implicitly, my greatest worry is that they are, for political economy reasons, are not able to follow through on the kinds of programs that are outlined in their 12th five-year plan, that they cannot get consumption growth growing more rapidly to become a significant driver of the overall GDP growth, and that the economy slows down substantially. I think that's probably the biggest single risk. There are a lot of forces that don't want to rebalance the economy. All the provincial people on the coast are in favor of continuing to have an undervalued exchange rate and growth based on exports. There are other people who don't want to undertake the kind of financial reforms, the liberalization of interest rates and so forth that would be necessary to contribute more to the growth of household income. Financial repression is a huge problem for China because it involves a very high implicit tax on consumers. That has to be ended, but it will be messy.
Nick, following up on that and broadening the question, any significant risk, do you think, of political instability in the Chinese authoritarian system? There's been some stories that maybe what's going on in the Middle East will have some spillover even to China. We know there have been some anxieties expressed on the part of the Chinese leadership. Do you see anything of that type as possibly rocking the economic boat?
Well, I always think as an economist I shouldn't comment on a question like that, but forced to do so, my answer is I think the risks of political instability in China are low, although you do have to raise the question, and Doug and I were talking about this earlier, given the reaction of the Chinese government imprisoning all kinds of dissidents and human rights lawyers and others over the past couple of months, you wonder if they know something that we don't know and that perhaps maybe the system is more fragile than it appears from the outside. So my short answer is, seems like a low probability, but I think there are a lot of unknowns.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Karen?
Karen Johnson, this question's from Mike. I was a bit startled to see you're emphasizing a recovery in housing, residential construction, partly because I think we all agree that maybe we overdid it before, and we really don't want the housing sector to go back to the size it was. We don't want it to be 6% of GDP again. Plus, we have a sense that over some medium term, there are going to be pressures on the size of government and maybe some need to shift resources between the private sector and the public sector on those grounds. So is there a need for structural adjustment in the U.S. economy that is somehow not yet happening? Is it part of the reason the U.S. recovery is tepid at the very least? And are there short-term implications of this? Are you embedding some of that in your forecast, or is that a risk to your forecast? Where do you put these structural issues?
I think there's little doubt that significant restructuring of the U.S. economy is needed and is ongoing. So what we've seen is that residential investment, which was 6.3% of GDP, has dropped to 2.4%. Well, I don't think it's going back to 6.3%, but I think it's headed back to 5.5%, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The other thing that happened was people were using the equity in their homes to finance a higher level of consumption, lower level of savings. Well, now the savings rate has gone back up at least to 6%. So that's restructuring of the economy away from consumption and from residential investment. Meanwhile, at least if you believe the trade figures, the U.S. real trade deficit has shrunk from 6% or a little bit more of GDP at the peak to a little less than 3% at the trough, and now it's a little bigger than that. So we've restructured in the direction of lower domestic spending on consumption and residential investment and a higher real net exports, which is, I think, the direction in which we should be moving. Now, what about the recovery in residential investment? Normally, with population growth, about 1.2 million new households are added each year, and about 500,000 units disappear from the housing stock. So in normal times, you think you need about 1.7 million new housing units. Part of what's happened is a disruption of the housing market. So even people who can pay their mortgages, they don't have the gain in equity or even the positive equity to upgrade their house by moving to another one. We sort of choked that off. The other thing that's clearly happened in the recession is that the level of separate maintenance, that is to say, kids moving away from living with their parents, have been reversed. And the number of independent households has gone down as a response to the economic hard times. I think as economic conditions improve and unemployment comes down, the demand for separate maintenance will probably rise back again. So the demand for individual separate housing units, which has taken a considerable knock, I mean, if 2% of independent households recombine, that's 2.5 million units reduction in the stock demand for housing units. I think that's about what we've seen from that phenomenon. And I think over the course of time, that will, not entirely perhaps, but will significantly reverse. So I'm talking about another roughly $400 billion of investment in real residential investment, which would take us back not to the 784, but to about 650 on that. So back to 5 or 5.5% of GDP, or a little less because GDP is growing, which I think is a reasonable prospect if we're thinking about a 4 or 5 year recovery. So I see the recovery of housing investment being capable of driving an important part of the recovery, not just in 2012, but spread out over a 4 or 5 year period to get us back to, say, 5%, something like that, not 6.3% of GDP. Similarly, on the consumption side, I see perhaps, if anything, a little bit more of an increase in the savings rate. So we're going to be a less consumption, less residential investment-oriented economy in terms of our structure, and more export-oriented, and I think that that's a good thing and a necessary thing.
Question back there. And then Jim.
Hi, Kevin Hall with McClatchy. We've talked so much about housing. I thought we stumbled on the Mortgage Bankers Association conference. I've been to a lot of these over the years, and this is the first time I think there's been almost no discussion of international trade. Can you talk a little bit about the Doha round, dead on a doorknob? Do you see any, in the absence of that, bilaterals, Brazil, India, and the U.S., anything you see happening there?
Well, I was told never speak ill of the dead.
If your question, Kevin, relates to global growth, I think Mike put it right. But beyond that, our studies show that even a, quote, successful Doha round, if that meant adoption of the package currently on offer, would have indistinguishable effects on the world economy. That may shock people because you hear some big numbers thrown around as to what the Doha round could do for world trade and world growth. My response is partly because it would be phased in over a very long period of time, at best 10 years or so, but also because the detailed studies we've done, Gary Huffbauer and Jeff Schott, show that the impact on individual countries is almost indistinguishable from zero, and that explains the lack of enthusiasm for completing the round. What their study showed was that if the current package now on the table for agriculture, non-agricultural trade, and services, which is virtually zero, if that current package was adopted, it would expand U.S. exports by all of $7 billion. In short, so small that it wouldn't even show up in a rounding error. Now, you could then, as they propose, expand the package by bringing in a meaningful services agreement, by achieving some sectoral deals, by bringing some trade facilitation measures onto the table, and you could make it into something meaningful. But at least at the moment, the economic effects of what has been agreed over these laborious 10 years of talks really is quite puny. And in turn, I think that does basically explain the lack of enthusiasm, certainly in this country, but elsewhere as well. Some of you were here. We had Congressman Levin here last week. He's no great enthusiast of Doha, but he doesn't really oppose it very much. And I asked him privately on the way out why he referred to it so little. He said because he never has any visitors who raise the Doha round with him. Zero. Far fewer than the Panama FTA, for example. So in terms of economic impact, I'm afraid that's the reality. Again, you could make it into something, particularly if you brought services significantly into the equation. But at the moment, I don't think it's going to affect the outlook that any of my colleagues have indicated. Colin? Yeah.
Thank you, Fred. Colin Bradford from Brookings and CG in Waterloo, Canada. A question, Nick, for you. The G20 in Korea in last year, on the heels of the Gwangju Ministers of Finance meeting, got into a big wrangle about the framework for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. What you seem to be suggesting, and this is the question, is that natural forces, market forces are underway with fiscal consolidation in the U.S. and rising savings in the private sector, and the Chinese consumption growth and external balance coming back a bit, that without much dirigistes behavior from the G20 in France this year, maybe this thing will correct itself without any international cooperation, so to speak, that market forces are underway. Is that a correct interpretation or not?
You're putting it more strongly than I would. I said something to the effect that maybe the prospects for a protectionist backlash are diminishing. I didn't say they were eliminated. And I'm quite frankly a little bit puzzled by the data that we see. The trade surplus has come down so dramatically from a relatively modest increase in the value of the RMB over a fairly long period of time. Obviously, part of that was due to the global downturn, but now the global economy is recovering, and we see the trade surplus at well under half of the peak. And in the first 2 months of this year, they're running a deficit. And the first 2 months of last year, they ran a $22 billion surplus. So I'm hedging, basically, because I feel less confident that we can fully explain what's happening.
Jim?
Jim Colby, German Marshall Fund. Michael, To what extent will the failure of Congress and the president to reach any kind of meaningful agreement on how to balance the budget or to make significant changes in the budget, the spending and revenue picture, how will that affect your projections, particularly if we're looking at trillion-plus deficits stretching at least through the rest of this decade? What impact is that going to have on interest rates?
Well, I think eventually it's going to push interest rates up. I think there's a limit to how big the debt-to-GDP ratio can become for the United States, which is different from Japan in important respects. That is to say, we're not financing it with domestic savings, and so we need to be careful. So we're headed up, it looks now, close to 100% of GDP, even with some reasonable effort to limit the deficit and bring it down below the $1 trillion level. I am, however, a little more optimistic about what deficit reduction will ultimately deliver. We can be assured that the process will not be pretty, and that this is going to be sausage making at the extreme as we get through the process. But I think we will see over the course of the next 2 years already a significant reduction in the deficit. The stimulus package is largely expiring. Some of the temporary measures to boost the economy adopted in the tax package will also be eliminated. And I think there will be some action on entitlements as well as on discretionary spending. There's going to be a lot of noise and hubbub in the meantime, but I think the question is, will in the end the political system deliver a result when the public is beginning to become a little nervous about the extent of our borrowing and debt and wants these people to do something even if they don't give a particularly clear message about exactly what.
Jim, I would elaborate on that slightly. Our newest senior fellow here at the Institute is Carmen Reinhardt, who has studied these issues in great depth. And if she were here and on the platform, I think she would make 2 points. One is that coming out of a financial crisis of the type we have seen, history suggests that afflicted countries will suffer a doubling of their debt-to-GDP ratios. And so far, that forecast looks right on, because the U.S. went into the crisis at about 40. It looks for sure that we'll hit 80 and maybe even more. Her second historical finding is that when countries' debt-to-GDP ratios exceeds 90%, that turns out to be the magic threshold in Reinhardt-Rogoff, that you subsequently experience growth rates 1 to 1.5 percentage points lower than your traditional norms. And therefore, you better bring those ratios back down if you want to get on a more sustainable growth path. Now, that's aggregating a lot of different countries over a long period of time, in fact, several centuries of history. You can make arguments why the U.S. will escape some of that, although you could also argue why the U.S. might be harder hit, namely, and she would emphasize as a third point, our heavy dependence on foreign lenders, which sometimes can make your situation more precarious and turn the international use of the dollar into a vice rather than a virtue. Only to say that her readings off the historical record suggest that this could be quite serious. Not that it would necessarily trigger a crisis, though it might, and she also notes the prevalence of crises coming out of such periods, but that it does tend to depress growth through higher interest rates, variety of other factors. Financial repression tends to be a response by authorities to try to limit the impact of the big debt servicing costs that result from a debt buildup of that magnitude. And so it is at your peril that you let yourself in for that kind of experience. Okay, we're at our witching hour, I regret to say. A lot of other hands up. I want to thank Mike, Nick, and Marcus in particular. Thank all of you for coming. Meeting adjourned.